The Missouri River rose that spring, burying the bottoms under 20 feet of cold, suffocating water. Before families could grieve their losses, Kansas City planners were drawing lines on maps. They sketched a highway, concrete and steel, to ensure the bottoms could never be rebuilt. From above, the floodwaters stretched gray and endless, broken only by one structure, a church steeple. Lincoln Memorial Church rose through the murk like a finger pointing at what the water had erased. In July 1951, a man climbed onto his rooftop, the floodwaters still receding below him. Against his chest, he held a deed, his proof of ownership, sealed in waterproof paper. 22 years he'd owned that house. 22 years of payments, of roots, of home. Yet the highway blueprints showed the asphalt cutting directly through his street, through his neighborhood. Through the bottoms, the oldest black neighborhood Kansas City had ever known, since 1865. The Bottoms was born the moment slavery legally ended in America. The same year, the same breath. White landowners had abandoned the riverbank as worthless, flood-prone, unstable, unwanted. Black families claimed it anyway, built homes from nothing on the only ground available to them. They dug foundations into that muddy ground with their hands. By 1900, the Bottoms had a functioning economy. Black-owned businesses lined Wyandotte Street from end to end. This neighborhood predated the famous 18th and Vine Jazz District by decades. Before Kansas City had jazz clubs, it had the Bottoms. The men who built it wore their best coats to Sunday services. Women carried covered dishes down unpaved roads to neighborhood gatherings. Children ran between houses that their grandparents had raised from bare ground. This was not a temporary settlement. This was a permanent city within a city. And the people who built it knew exactly what they had made. Here is where it turns. The Missouri River had flooded the Bottoms before, many times. 1884, 1903, 1940. Each time, the community rebuilt. Each time, families returned to the same streets, the same neighbors, home. Flooding was a condition of life in the Bottoms, not a death sentence. But the flood of 1951 was different. Not because the water was deeper, though it was. Different because of what was waiting on the other side of the water. In Washington, Congress had passed the Housing Act of 1949. Federal disaster relief arrived, but not evenly. White property owners with cleaner title documents got more aid. Black families in the Bottoms often lacked the legal paperwork the programs required, because the systems that recorded property ownership had not always included them fairly. Families who wanted to rebuild found the aid programs nearly impossible to access. That man on the rooftop with his deed pressed to his chest, he understood something the city did not want him to understand. That paper was his only proof against what was coming. But here is what nobody tells you. Proof was not enough. The highway needed to pass through the city. There were multiple possible routes. The route they chose ran directly through black-owned properties in the Bottoms. The evidence suggests this was not an oversight. The neighborhood had already been labeled blighted by the same city government. Eminent domain is the legal power to seize private property for public use. The government must pay owners, but it sets the price. The checks did not reflect what the land, the community, or the history was worth. Some families took the money because they had no other choice. Others held out, appealing to city councils that had already decided. The highway was coming regardless. By 1965, Interstate 70 ran where Wyandotte Street had been. It consumed territory that black families had owned since 1865. A federal highway program that provided the money and the final mechanism. One neighborhood, three forms of destruction, arriving in less than a decade. And history was about to record only one of them, the flood. The other two would be harder to find, because someone made sure of that. Nobody called it displacement. The city called it clearance. That word choice was not accidental. Clearance sounds like cleaning something dirty. And that was exactly the point. Urban renewal was the phrase that appeared in every federal document. Urban renewal meant tearing down what black families had built. Kansas City used that tool with precision. First, you label the neighborhood blighted. Then you apply for federal demolition money. Then you route the highway through. 3 steps, each one making the next one easier. So when Kansas City applied for interstate funds, the paperwork was clean. A neighborhood already on paper as a slum could be erased without much argument. The argument had been won before residents knew there was a fight. Look at how the mechanism worked. Flood first, then erase, then pave over what remained. The 1956 Transportation Bill did not name any black neighborhood. It just moved money from Washington to cities and let local planners decide. Local planners in Kansas City decided to run Interstate 70 east through the old flood zone. That decision required the sign-off of city engineers, city council members, and a federal review board. Not one of those bodies had significant black representation. The people most affected had no institutional voice in the rooms where the decision was made. That is not interpretation. That is the composition of Kansas City's planning department in the 1950s. An all-white planning board made decisions about a black neighborhood, and the federal government funded it. Here is where it gets worse. Eminent domain gave the city legal authority to take private land, but the price the city paid was set by city-appointed appraisers. Those appraisers, again and again, valued black neighborhoods at a fraction of white ones. Historians studying mid-century urban renewal have documented this pattern across dozens of American cities. Kansas City was not an exception. A family that had built equity over 3 generations received a check that reflected none of that history. The check was legal. The price was wrong. A man would have stood in his kitchen with that check in his hand, the same kitchen where his father had sat, where his children had eaten breakfast. That payment did not account for what those 40 years were actually worth. No public hearing where a man with deed papers could stand up and object. No independent assessors. No outside experts. City officials made that call themselves. From 1956 through 1965, 1,500 to 2,000 black households left the bottoms. Some left before the bulldozers arrived, selling to the city early. Others held until the last possible moment, watching their street disappear block by block. What happened to those families when they left? The city did not track them. Federal relocation assistance existed on paper. In practice, it was poorly funded and unevenly applied. Black families displaced from the bottoms found Kansas City's segregated neighborhoods still mostly closed to them. Racial covenants had been ruled unenforceable in 1948, but ruling them unenforceable did not stop banks from refusing mortgages or landlords from closing doors. So families displaced from the bottoms moved east into existing black neighborhoods that were already crowded, already stretched past what they could hold. The destruction of one neighborhood put pressure on every other. Those same forces that had confined black residents to the bottoms in the first place now erased them from it entirely. Not a tragedy, a designed outcome. Now pull back and look at the logic the planners were using. Kansas City planners in the 1950s believed what many American city officials believed then. They believed dense, older neighborhoods near industrial zones were holding cities back. They believed highways moving cars through cities was progress. City officials decided the land held more value as a highway route than as a living, breathing neighborhood where families thrived. That logic was applied to black neighborhoods at a rate far exceeding white neighborhoods across America. Federal authorities later acknowledged this pattern during 1968 congressional hearings. Nobody in the planning office thought they were doing something wrong. They thought they were modernizing. That is exactly how the most permanent damage gets done. Not by people who know they are causing harm, but by people absolutely certain they are helping. Lincoln Memorial Church had survived every flood because the community around it held together. After the highway, there was no community left to hold. What is a church without its people within walking distance? What is a school without the children from the surrounding streets? What is a barbershop when the men who came every Saturday are now scattered across 4 zip codes? The highway did not just remove buildings. It took the web of daily life that made those buildings matter. By 1965, asphalt replaced Wyandotte Street. Exactly 100 years of black Kansas City buried under concrete. And the city moved on. New businesses opened elsewhere. New neighborhoods got city investment. The bottoms did not appear in Kansas City tourism materials, planning documents, or school curricula. History had been repaved, and nobody left a marker. Interstate 70 is still there. You can drive it today, windows down, no sense of what is underneath. The concrete does not tell you what it replaced. Families who lost property in the bottoms did not just lose houses. They watched their children's inheritance crumble into nothing. Wealth does not disappear when a building is demolished. It transfers to whoever holds the land after. Kansas City held the land after. The highway increased the value of every commercial corridor it connected. None of that increased value returned to the families who had been removed. That is not commentary. That is how asset transfer works. They lost what those houses would have been worth in 1978, in 1998, in 2018. Compounded equity, passed from parent to child, is how generational wealth is built in America. The method was surgical, deliberate, wrapped in the language of progress and urban planning, legal destruction dressed as necessity. The children who grew up in the bottoms carried something in their bodies that no check could measure. That specific block corner held memories of their grandfather's barbering business. They could close their eyes and walk the length of Wyandotte Street from memory. That knowledge had nowhere to land after the street was gone. It became a private grief with no public marker to stand beside. Now look at who benefited. Interstate 70 connected Kansas City to the national highway grid. Businesses along that corridor gained access to a market they had not had before. Suburbs east and west of the city became more accessible to white commuters. Property values in those suburbs climbed through the 1960s and 70s. The families who moved into those suburbs built equity on a foundation the bottoms helped pay for. Not metaphorically, in terms of actual land value created by system they did not choose. Kansas City's downtown development in the 1960s was partly enabled by the clearance of the bottoms. Investors moved into areas adjacent to the new highway corridor with city support. None of those investment documents mentioned what had stood there before. Here is a specific absence worth noting. No historic landmark designation was applied to any part of the bottoms before demolition. The Missouri State Historic Preservation Office had no file on the neighborhood. The city's own planning archives from the 1950s contained no cultural impact assessment. Planners were not required to produce one. The Housing Act of 1949 contained no provisions protecting cultural heritage sites. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 similarly lacked such safeguards. Neither statute addressed whether neighborhoods deserved consideration beyond monetary property assessments. That silence was not oversight. It was the design of those laws. And the design worked exactly as built. In 1957, a man stood in his kitchen holding an official city check. The kitchen window looked out onto a street his family had lived on for 40 years. Outside, 2 houses down, a neighbor was stacking furniture on the curb. He folded the check and put it in his shirt pocket. He did not speak to the city official standing at the door. There was nothing left to say to someone who had already decided. When Republicans gathered in Kansas City for their 1976 convention, the bottoms had been gone for over a decade. The convention brought national attention to the city's modern system. Media coverage praised Kansas City's interstate system and efficient transportation corridors. Not one wire story mentioned what those corridors had replaced. The silence in that coverage was complete. Then came the years when the history started trying to surface. During the 1980s, African American scholars began collecting community testimony. They found elderly residents who could name every business on Wyandotte Street from memory. Those residents named grocers, churches, seamstresses, insurance agents, and numbers runners. A full economy held entirely in the memory of people who had lived inside it. The problem with oral history is that it requires someone willing to record it, and institutions willing to hold it. The Kansas City Public Library System did not begin formally archiving Black neighborhood oral histories until decades after the displacement. By then, many of the witnesses were gone. Whole chapters of the city's founding went unrecorded because the recording happened too late. Kansas City's official tourism materials describe 18th and Vine as the heart of the city's Black history. The Bottoms does not appear in those materials. The neighborhood enabling jazz's existence has no place in that story. That is a curatorial decision made by people with the authority to decide what a city remembers. Historians and grassroots advocates submitted a request to city officials in 2015 asking for a historical marker along the Interstate 70 corridor. The petition moved through city channels, slowly. Through the early 2020s, no marker appeared. The ground under Interstate 70 remains unmarked. What stands instead is the highway itself, which is its own kind of monument. Not to what was there, but to the decision to remove it. a concrete structure memorializing a choice the city has never formally named as such. In 1951, Lincoln Memorial Church's steeple rose above the floodwater, not pleading, pointing at the sky the way things do when everything around them has been taken. The church eventually lost its congregation to 4 zip codes. A building needs people within walking distance to remain a church. Without them, it is only architecture. The Bottoms was built by people who understood that better than anyone. The story of the Bottoms was never an accident of forgetting.